Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danny Nierenberg, president of Food Tank. This has been an incredible week. We've had 4 incredible discussions around the Refresh Working Group's Food Plus Tech policy platform. These conversations have focused on data protection, supply chain transparency, broadband expansion, and a digitally skilled workforce. And today we'll talk about strengthening supply chains to improve food security. Our previous live streams and the platform are available at foodtank.com. And the Refresh Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform made up of farmers, academics, entrepreneurs, chefs, advocates, technologists, and other experts who really wish to explore the complex intersection of agriculture, food, and technology. And I am really proud to be a member of that group. I'm also really thankful that my co-host, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes, has been with me this whole week, asking really insightful questions to Refresh Working Group members and, again, other experts. Today, we have another great group. We'll talk to Tatiana Garcia Granados, the co-founder, COO, and executive director of the Carmen Market in Philadelphia and Atlanta. We also have Karen Washington, the co-founder of Rise and Root Farm, the co-founder of Black Urban Growers, and the co-founder of La Familia Verde Garden Coalition. She is also on the board of the Black Farmer Fund, and she is a member of the Refresh Working Group. We have Amy Wu, the founder of From Farms to Incubators, a multimedia platform that uses documentary, video, photography, and the written word to tell the stories of women leaders and innovators in ag tech. And she's coming out with a new book later this year. She's also a member of the Refresh Working Group. And we have Chris Roper from Chris Roper Services and consultant to the Osage Nation. His work is food sovereignty oriented, and he is working to help set up a meat processing plant for the Osage Nation. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a true honor to see you all. Chloe, I'm going to turn it over to you for the first question.
Thank you so much. Over the past 4 days, we have talked about how technology and limited access to broadband has widened inequities already too deep in our country, and how the industrialized food system has created externalities that hurt us all, from a food, health, and nutrition crisis to a hunger crisis. I'm really glad that we're ending the week on the discussion today about sovereignty, stability, and bridging the gap both physically and digitally, because I think it's really going to encompass all that we've really already been talking about, from apps that translate data from food purchases into coupons and recipes to incentivize healthy food purchases, to the mobile markets that bring fresh produce into areas of food apartheid. Solutions are emerging, but how do we make sure the system of the future doesn't replicate the mistakes of the past? With that, I'd love to kick off by asking our amazing panelists, beyond shorter supply chains, what else is really needed to address food insecurity today?
This is Karen, so I'm going to start because, first of all, to really recognize that it exists. I think for so long, the conversation around inequities, around wealth, land access, food access has been, brushed underneath the table and has really not been to the forefront. And I think what COVID has done is really bring this conversation to the forefront. We cannot go back. So now is the time for us to roll up our sleeves to make sure that food and water are available to all, because they're both human rights.
I think piggybacking, this is Amy, I think piggybacking on what Karen said, I think it's important also that growers make a connection to a distribution network on how to get the food out. I live in the Hudson Valley. We've got tons of small farms here growing vegetables. We've got livestock as well. And I know that during the pandemic, I've talked to a lot of different growers who are like, I want to find a way to get, I've got extra produce. You've got orphan strawberries and melons and stuff. How can we get it out to help communities, especially underserved communities and schools and so forth. So I think finding a way to bridge that, bridge a connection between growers and the community is really important too.
Absolutely. And building on that, just thinking about our food system and how it's really a reflection of our society as a whole. And the moment that we're in, we need to heal our world. And the way to do that is to heal a lot of the divisions between people. And the food and the food system is such an important vehicle for that, to bridge the divides, the urban and rural divides, the ideological divides, racial divides, economic divides. And really, unless we start to build bridges, as everybody's been saying, between these communities, we will not heal our society.
I'll add
Such
to those
great
as well.
apps. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I'd like to add to those as well. We have some deep training gaps in the food world. Along with some of the things I've done in meat processing, there's a dire need for people to learn that trade. With some of the new plants coming online, there's a lot of tribes building new facilities. There's a lot of existing facilities that are trying to expand, but there's an extreme labor shortage, skilled labor in the meat trades, as well as some of the things that the other panelists have mentioned already. Well, so there's a lot of growers out there that have a surplus and excess that they want to get out, but there's training that needs to happen on training people how to preserve foods. Once you have that surplus, you need to be able to can it, freeze it, dry it, so that it can be used later on. There's a lot of training that needs to happen in all aspects of food security and food production.
Chris, I'm so glad you brought up that preservation point. When the pandemic first began, a lot of what I was hearing from talking to experts is that if there had been more regional processing facilities, like the ones you're trying to build in with Native communities, or if there had been more mills or canneries or tinneries or that kind of thing, that a lot of the problems that we saw with supply chain disruptions would have not existed. And I'm wondering, what from your perspective, how we can bring back those sort of regional preservation technologies and innovations back to communities.
It's very regionalized and very community driven. And I've been fortunate to work with groups, and I was working with groups when the pandemic hit. And we were already trying to teach canning and food preservation when the pandemic hit. And we were doing some meat production on some smaller scales. But when the pandemic hit, and it really showed the world how weak our food supplies were and how weak our food chains were, the minute that the grocery store started depleting supplies and not being able to get the supplies back into the communities, people wanted to learn how they could can food, because there were a surplus of meats and vegetables and milk available when the restaurants closed. There was nowhere to go with it. I was able to work with the Intertribal Ag Council in distributing live animals even. We were able to move 900 pigs that were going to be euthanized and get those to families that were able to process them themselves. A lot of native farmers and ranchers and a lot of rural folks still process animals on their own. It seems odd to some in larger, more urban settings, but in rural America, that happens a lot. And those animals should have never been euthanized. There should have been an outreach effort to get those animals out to communities that could use them, because they didn't need to have mass burials and euthanizations of animals that just couldn't be processed at the big plants. The small plants, we have a huge network in this United States that we're in, and that needs to be tapped, and we need to tie people together better, and we need to get those products into the hands of people that need them.
Thank you, Chris. I think one of the most interesting things that I loved hearing about the new plant that you built with the Osage Nation that just opened less than a month ago is that it also included things like a smoker for jerky and preservation, which, again, to your point, so many of these plants just don't have the real food applications. And I think that's what is really missing. I want to take this next question to Karen, though. Karen, can you share, what roles do Rise and Root Farm and the Black urban growers play in the push for a more equitable food system?
Well, really bringing to the surface the fact that we do have inequities in our food system. When people were telling us time and time again that the food system was broken and needed to be fixed, we question that, because it's like, well, look at the food system in terms of the inequity it has, especially around underserved communities and communities of color. So the problem is not that the food system needs to be fixed. it needs to change. And that change starts with shifting of power. For so long, power has been in predominantly a handful of white men when it comes to the food system. And so how do we shift that power back into the hands of communities that for so long have had people with power over them? And so now what you're starting to see is more involvement in communities of color to get back their power, to be more outspoken into this food system, and to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And that seat at the table means that they have a voice. Diversity and inclusion means nothing unless those people sitting at that table have the power to make change.
Thank you. Yesterday, we spoke a lot about different ownership models and how community banks could be an option here because it would be funding the community and for the community. Danny, I'll turn it over to you, but I'm hopefully that we can talk more about those types of solutions throughout this panel.
No, absolutely. Such interesting innovations that are happening on that front. Karen, you and I have talked a lot in the past about how it's not that communities need, training. It's not that they need people to come in and tell them what they need to do. They already know what to do. But what they need is investment and capital. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, because everyone knows, a lot of us know that this industrial system has really promoted a charity-based, subsidized food system that is not sustainable. And so what we're trying to do is to make sure that we talk about innovative ways, technology ways that people can advance. And I think I like what I heard from Chris. I like what I heard from Amy. Again, how does technology come into communities to inspire them to learn about training, which is really important, to learn about education. And I think it starts with developing trust. A lot of these underserved communities don't have trust when it comes to big ag and government. So how do we, number one, build trust? And then also, how do we build relationships? The future is technology, y'all. The future is technology. So how do we build relationships? And when I talk about relationships, it's not just coming into communities and wipe your hands and it's done. Relationships means that you're there for the long haul, that you're investing in the community, that you're putting in money for technology, for training, so that at the end of the day, these jobs will exist for the next generation.
I'm so glad
into that.
Of course. No, please go ahead.
I'll just jump in here. I really like what Karen said. And I think beyond technology and innovation, it's like how to share that knowledge and information, because there are so many different quote unquote innovation. When I think of innovation, I don't just think about the actual machinery, for example. I also think about the ways that we grow. So for example, if you're a small farmer, what kind of information could you use for cover cropping, for example? What innovative ways are used in terms of strategy with growing things? I'm using cover cropping as an example, but I feel like it's important to also find a way to bridge that gap and bring that knowledge to small and beginner farmers as well, and of course the underserved communities also.
Absolutely. And Karen, I love the idea of building relationships. I think, what you said before about how COVID has uncovered all of these things, and it's uncovered this lack of relationships, between communities and between innovators, and it's really exposed how silos need to be broken down. Bernard Pollock, my co-founder, is on the back end. Can you bring Matthew Broad's question back up? So for our listeners, for folks who aren't watching, Matthew says, education is key. Can social media platforms be used as a tool to help build the awareness of current food systems to let the people impacted most feel empowered and knowledgeable? And I don't know, anyone can jump in there.
I'd love to answer that question. Thank you, Matt. Matt was really instrumental in Common Market, Texas, and in getting, kind of the launch in Houston. And I think that, he's asked a really great point, which is how do we involve eaters in food policy and in all of these decisions? And I think that in social media and education are really key. We are making so many decisions every day on, with what we're choosing to purchase. And really, when we don't have the information, we're really limited to what impact we can have with our purchasing power. And so I do see that, social media and technology can play a huge role in this.
Thanks so much. Chloe, over to you.
Amy, I want to turn it over to you. I'd love to hear a bit more. There's also a question earlier from someone else about equitability in terms of startups. So you've been looking at so many different ag tech startups. You've got a great book coming out all about this and women in ag tech. So what ag tech startups and what types of startups are creating a more equitable future when it comes to technology? Specifically around the equitability in startups, I'd be curious to hear about.
So in terms of equitability, I guess I just want to throw the question back to clarify. How are you defining equitability again?
I think it depends. I mean, this came from David Jones. If we can pull that up. Can you speak to any equitable community, consumer-facing technologies that are being utilized to facilitate this?
I think that with the technologies and innovation that I've been looking at, and we call it ag tech, the marriage between agriculture and technology, but the big picture of it is all of that innovation and technology is designed to help growers solve problems. And growers have been facing a lot of problems, a lot of it starting with the bigger umbrella of climate change. So I think it was Chris that mentioned, like, there's a severe labor shortage, and also beyond severe labor shortage, you've got water and land management issues, changes with the climate, meaning like new pest problems for growers as well. So I feel like innovation technology really gives an opportunity for growers of all different sizes. We're not just talking about the big ag companies, but also potentially medium to smaller farmers to manage soil better, to manage pest better. And right now, some of that innovation technology might be kind of expensive because a lot of it's still in the beta phase. But I think eventually it's going to be more accessible to farmers of different sizes. And then maybe there are backyard gardeners who are interested in growing their own food, including myself. I'm going to try this season. Or folks who want to start their own farm to have access to food or to share it with their neighbors, and they'll have hopefully access to these technologies as well. And I hope that answers some of the question.
Can I just give a big up to Amy because of the fact that people don't understand that the majority of people in this global economy are women. Women for years, decades have lacked the advantage of having technology. And so the work that Amy is doing is really to uplift women's voices in terms of technology. I have to, hand it to her. I think this is something that needs to be discussed because, again, for so long, women have been out of the field when it comes to technology. So hats off to you, Amy, for the work that you're doing to uplift our voices.
Oh, thank you, Karen. I just wanted to mention something briefly on that, is that it's an exciting time actually as well because of this need for new innovation or technologies. And there's so many amazing women who have STEM backgrounds who are actually able to get into the door and contribute with their creativity and their entrepreneurial spirit. So thank you. Yeah.
It's hand in hand, there's the technology, but there's also the access to markets. And I just saw a comment about capital and part of the conversation is also about policy and thinking about what are the policy decisions that are being made that can also create markets for women, for entrepreneurs to be able to access. And if you think about our current food system and how it really is, a lot of the policies are, disincentivizing and making it really hard for also, even with the access to technology, if you don't also have access to markets, there's going to be a disconnect. And so I think that the two really do need to go hand in hand.
Tatiana, I'd love to continue with you. I mean, you've been quoted as saying it's cheaper to get a truckload of food from California to New York than a pallet from upstate New York to New York City. And I think there's a role for technology there. But, how are you and the common market working to really economically transform that supply chain to benefit both small farmers and eaters and really, all of us who are seeking, better kinds of food sources?
Well, I think that there are, two answers to that question. One of it is about the appropriate scale. and thinking about, as we're kind of transforming the food system, what is the right scale where the prices come down to a point where there is affordability, but that we're not kind of repeating some of the same mistakes that the industrial food system made. So I think that scale is one of them, and finding the appropriate scale for the cost. And then I think the second is back to this, the pricing, and just thinking about, how do we, whether it's, pricing in the actual cost, there's so many externalities and, externalized costs in the cheap food. And so it does make it really hard for a farmer who is, in upstate New York and who has to compete with the product that is, subsidized in a lot of different ways. And so, I think the policy has an important role to play in really, preferencing some of the practices that aren't creating problems for society in the long run.
Absolutely. Before I go back to Chloe, you brought up two really important subjects that are close to my heart. One, this idea of redefining scale. Scale doesn't always mean scaling up. It can mean scaling out or scaling in different ways. And then, this idea of externalities. There's this, growing movement towards true cost accounting in the food system. And maybe, Chris, you can get into this later, because, the price of what we pay for food doesn't include those externalities that, you're talking about, whether it's pollution from factory farms or the benefits from a more regenerative agriculture system. So those are really important topics. Thank you for highlighting them.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm hoping that we can kind of continue with some of these topics, because you also brought up how the distribution is so important here. And I do think, especially when we're talking about scale, you're not really going to be able to meet the scale that I think local food needs to kind of meet the scale that industrialized, unfortunately, you have to compete with industrial. So logistically, it seems like distribution and Amy, I know you talked about this earlier in your beginning most opening remarks. Can you share a bit more about how you've seen startups attacking the distribution side and the retailing side of this? Because it does seem to me that local food, the way to be able to scale it has to have a distribution piece to the model.
Yeah, absolutely. When I touched upon it earlier, I think it was broadly speaking, but I've definitely observed that especially during COVID and during the pandemic, there's been a good number of growers who they want to help out. There's long food lines, out there, and there are school children in households that really need access to food. But it's like, so how do you get it out there? I think that one of the connections that growers really need is a connection to community organizations who specialize in distribution, particularly the distribution within the communities, whether that be churches, whether that be nursing homes or senior centers, or whether that be the school districts, which is a whole other story, and which leads me to another point regarding food safety as well. Actually, is an important part of the distribution and supply system area, because the growers that I've connected with, there are many guidelines and regulations they've always followed, like pre-COVID, but during COVID especially, I think there's greater focus on cleanliness, food safety, making that, more transparent. What are what's the process of literally field to table. So I think in terms of innovation, like there are numerous technologies and innovations that, for example, focus on like food safety. I do know of one woman that her company is called AgShift. She has a machine called the Hydra, and it uses artificial intelligence, for example, to grade berries and nuts, at a whole other level of objectivity versus using human beings and labor. So it sort of eventually it'll be more accessible to smaller farmers. But that's one example of how innovation can also contribute, I think, to the distribution system as well.
I like to add to that because even though I farm up in Chester, I live in the Bronx. So I saw the disconnect when it came to communication. I think this is where technology has to play a bigger part because of the fact, like Amy and so many people on this conference was talking about, is that farmers have the food, but getting it down to the people that need it the most. And I have, in my own two eyes, were there when we had community-based organizations waiting for food down in the Bronx, but yet farmers were saying, we have the food, but how do we get it down there? So this is where technology can really bridge that communication and that distribution problem that we have. And one thing, I just want to step back when we talked about, farmers, especially farmers in low-income neighborhoods. For me, it's the educational piece because, again, I am in a subsidized charity-based food system where food is free. And so as a farmer, I have to educate my consumers that there's a cost and value to the product that I bring so that the farmers can make money, can have a living. And sometimes that's not being discussed when it comes to servicing underserved communities.
Thanks so much, Karen. And this is a question, I think, for both you and Chris. We talked about broadband, the need for broadband expansion earlier this week. And Susan had a comment up earlier, one of our viewers, about the need for broadband expansion. And so, Karen, for you and the Black Farmers Fund, and Chris, you're working again in Indigenous communities. Broadband is often an impediment because farmers don't have access to it. And I'm wondering if you can both sort of comment on how rural communities really need that source of communication, that source of creating markets to be successful. Chris, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can tackle that. I've literally had meetings this week with a couple of different tribal nations that broadband is on their forefront and trying to make sure, especially during this pandemic, getting access to even laptops for children that can do virtual learning at home. And, even if they had a laptop, they didn't have access to internet. So in a lot of these rural areas, it is a huge issue, and working with the tribes across the nation, they're really focusing on that right now. And we hope to be able to secure some grants and funding that can help bring not only wired connections, but wireless connections through different towers, different technology, that we can help get this internet out to these kids that are trying to learn in rural communities and on native communities.
And I like to add, it's not only the supply end of providing technology, it's the education that goes behind it. So make sure you just don't give people a laptop, and say, okay, you're on your own. Give them a laptop, but give them training on how to use it. I think the biggest challenge that we're having now is now with these EBT machines, because now they want everything to be now and more virtual in terms of technology, with technology using EBT machines. This year now, there was a really big problem of how farmers were going to be paid with their coupons, because the banks no longer want to deal with coupons. So now they got to find an innovative way so that farmers can now be paid. And that's going to happen through technology. But again, it has to be a learning curve. You just can't give people the supplies without the education behind it.
Absolutely. And I just want to say that Susan DeLandon had a really great comment that, the need for internet is not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue. And that education piece that Karen brought up is just so key to all of that. Chloe, back to you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Detroit, for those of you who don't know, nearly half of Detroit doesn't have access to broadband either, which is a huge issue for all the folks there, especially entrepreneurs and local businesses. I want to actually get back to Chris, because we've been kind of talking around the recent project you've been doing with the Osage Nation, but we actually haven't heard a little bit about really fully what it encompasses. And I'm pretty excited about it because I've been working on this book about the future of meat, and there's been a lot of comments on from the live stream about how there needs to be more local processing and more meat processing. And there was one comment about California. This is a huge issue, and most bankers think that a new plant takes around $100 million to build. But Chris Roper has been now doing this. This is, I think, your second plant that you've done this for. The first was the Coupon Nation. It cost around $4 million. I think it was the first USDA regulated plant for an indigenous community. And the Osage Nation plant just opened through a CARES Act grant. So I'd love to have you talk to us a little bit about how you've been able to do this and create sovereignty on, far less money than, conventional agriculture believes is necessary to be able to create a plant like this.
Sure. There are a lot of good projects going on right now. And as you mentioned, we're just opening a facility for the Osage Nation. And around $10 million is a good number for a medium-sized plant. The cost of building materials keeps going up dramatically every day between wood costs, steel costs, equipment costs. Part of that is to do with the pandemic and the issue of getting supplies out of the factories fast enough to get these facilities up and running. Part of the issues are training, getting employees trained. But, with the Osage Nation, we're taking that on. We have a lot of people that want to work and are willing to work, and they're being trained right now. So we'll make some of our first harvests on some live animals over the coming weeks and be able to put food on the table and help secure the local communities. And part of the pandemic really brought out the issues of the need of the large facilities. And if one of those facilities goes down, how it affects so many different people across the nation. And we've really taken a more of a regionalized approach, and not only in meat processing, but in vegetable production. I've heard so many great issues. Transportation's an issue, technology's an issue, financing is an issue. They're all huge issues across the nation. But meat production, being able to regionalize this production and take care of not only tribe members, communities, and that keeps growing. So when we're taking this product from birth to plate, animals are being raised on the lands, they're being fed, they're being cared for more humanely, they're being harvested more humanely. We can take the products, break them down, we can actually smoke those products, we can make shelf-stable products, from jerky, snack sticks. These products go into backpack programs, they go into elder nutrition program, child care nutrition programs. So they're supplying products for the entire community. And that just spurs more development, more training, and of course the need for technology. That's one of our biggest hurdles at Osage now, is getting the technology reliable in a facility that's in a rural area. I understand the need is everywhere. That's just my focus area seems to be rural areas and a lot of tribes across the nation. But the Osage Nation has really stepped up and done something to take care of their food security in their area. Food distribution is an issue, and from my past working with, once you have the food, how do you get it out to people? How do you preserve it to get it across the country? Trucking is a crazy cost that, as you all mentioned already, trying to move one pallet of product is really a tall hurdle. Refrigerated trucks, I saw that comment. You have to be able to have the capital to purchase this equipment or even be able to hire that out. And it's a very expensive venture. I've had customers call from the East Coast, and moving product from the Midwest to the East Coast, especially during this time of year, when you have snowstorms and everything else, trying to get it interstate commerce in the middle of a snowstorm, it's a matter of it's not how you can get it there, it's if you can get it there. So I know there's food available. We definitely need help with technology to be able to connect people that have food to the people that need food. It's a huge issue across the nation. We really need more organizations focusing on this. There are some wonderful native groups that are working on various initiatives, and I'm very fortunate to be able to have that pool of resources inside some of these native communities to be able to tie native communities together. But we need to be able to broaden that and bring different cities together, different cultures together, and solve the bigger problems. So, but meat plants are just one of them. I know of at least 4 medium-sized plants going up in Oklahoma right now. I work with a few other tribes in different parts of the United States that are looking at doing these meat plants as well. There's numerous small plants available, but it's not $100 million issue. The small plants can be put up economically and can take care of communities in a medium-sized plant. So it's been proven it can be done, and it needs to happen more often so that we can take care of these smaller areas.
Thank you. I am so excited about how replicable it already has truly proven to be. And before I let Danny ask the next question, I just want to, the 2 points I'd love to have you touch on just a bit more, because I am the Forbes business model supply chain kind of ownership model nerd. I think the really interesting thing about this is that this grant, this is now a community utility essentially. And we've been talking about public utilities throughout the week in different respects, but this plant is currently owned by the Osage Nation. It's only for the Osage Nation, and it's a utility for that nation, which I think is hugely important. And I'd also just love if you could touch on how this is also adding back capacity for bison slaughter, particularly, which we know has just such cultural ramifications for Native communities, and how that particularly has just been, just completely diminished over time in terms of capacity, and how these plants are flexible to do both cattle and bison, because I think that also is extremely rare, and I think people would want to know about that.
Yeah, it's very important. And a lot of the tribes do focus on bison production as well, because it ties back to their culture. They need to be able to get that meat back into their culture, back into their schools, their systems. So not only you can teach on it, but bring the cultural aspect back. You need to be able to handle those animals humanely. So you do have to plan this into your construction when you are building a facility like this, but it can be done relatively simple when you plan for it. And these plants are being built to handle bison, pork, beef, and a lot of other species. Wild animals such as the deer and elk are being processed in these facilities as well. So you can plan for this. It can happen. It's been proven. So even with the aquaponics, the greenhouse facilities, the Osage Nation has really branched out. They've got 40,000 square feet of greenhouse available now to start growing food for their community. They have the aquaponics facility. So food sovereignty is a real issue, and it's something that's being tackled across the nation. I feel good about a lot of the projects that are happening, and not just with tribes, but a lot of great things happening in tribes right now.
That's so fantastic. And I want to turn back to Tatiana and Karen here about this idea of culturally appropriate foods, or more foods that are fit different communities. And Tatiana, your colleague, I think Matthew, asked this question earlier in a comment. So do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, going kind of building on the question about the infrastructure and all of the great work that Chris was just sharing, and it is about if we want to build an alternative food system, we need to build the alternative infrastructure as well. And we're talking about, it's like all of everything that goes into the food processing and all of the technology and education for the farmers, and then the distribution and the refrigerated trucks. And I think you brought up a really good question, which was is there a different ownership model that could have different outcomes? And for the common market, I think that the tribal nations ownership and the food sovereignty, that's an amazing model. And then thinking about, cooperatives and nonprofits. So the common market, we own 3 refrigerated warehouses and 14 refrigerated trucks in the 3 cities. And it's a nonprofit model. And so again, it's different than the, kind of the predominant industrial food system, but really trying out these different approaches to how we can capitalize the new infrastructure that we need to truly transform the food system. And, building on that, that having this, kind of smaller regional systems allows us to have more culturally appropriate food. And where we are able to, the food that the farmers that we're working with in Houston and in South Texas are, they are able to produce food that is more appropriate for their communities. And which is, so at odds with this really large scale, everything commodity that we're, the system that we're, we're trying to find an alternative to. And so I think it is a combination. It's really about supporting the small scale, but thinking about what are the large replicable investments and systems that we can create that will allow the smaller, the smaller regions to be able to exist.
Absolutely. And Karen, I think one of those systems that Tatiana is talking about is the Black Farmers Fund.
Yes, and also the fact that we have to make sure that when we talk about technology, that it's not technology and indigenous practices, that it goes hand in hand. And so we have to make sure that we acknowledge the indigenous practices that we have, and you can use that in pairing with technology, because sometimes that seems to be lost when we talk about technology. And for me, it's always about the word agriculture. That means the culture part that we need to really sort of, bring to the forefront. And that culture, it varies, across our nation. But at the end of the day, is what makes us, diverse, that makes us common. And so to make sure that when we talk about, what we're going to do in terms of scaling up, that we don't dismiss the indigenous practices that have for so long fed this country. And so I'm glad to hear what Chris is doing, and to make sure that people do uplift our culture, because that's what makes us great as a nation. And so with the Black Farmer Fund, what we're trying to do is, again, bring into the forefront the racial inequity that we have seen for so long in New York State. Primarily, the fund is geared towards New York State because out of 57,000 farmers, only 139 are Black. And so for years, and I am just saying this across the board, for so long, people of color have been dealing with zero to no resources. And so now, how do we build this economy and have money for training, for technology, if we don't have those hard conversations within our community? And so it's about educating people around in terms of credit, in terms of investment, what that looks like, so that at the end of the day, we can have farmers and businesses that can participate in an agricultural program that deals with technology. And I think that's important. That's what we're trying to do with Black Farmer Fund.
Absolutely.
Can I say something quickly?
Of course.
Based on what Karen is saying. So I also think it's a really good opportunity, because we've been talking about education on different levels, to the connection between food and cultural heritage as well. I think there's a real opportunity to actually connect, like, what specific growers are growing what. Like, there are certain vegetables, for example, that Asian vegetables or organic Asian vegetables, and use that as a learning opportunity for youth, especially youth who are really interested in learning more about farming and opportunities in agriculture as well.
Amy, I just want to stay with you for 1 second before I go back to Chloe. We've had 2 questions from our friends Prem Warrior from Vilagro and Julie Coonan about carbon sequestration and measuring carbon sequestration. So I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit, about how technologies that are being developed to help farmers do that, so that potentially, and this is kind of controversial right now, that they can participate in carbon markets.
Yes, thanks for that question. I saw a couple of the questions pop up, actually. So I think there's a real opportunity, and actually there are a growing number of ag tech startups who have seen this opportunity for creating different types of innovation. I'll talk a little bit more about that, that addresses soil health. I think the key to a lot of we start with soil, and healthy soil creating healthy foods, and what kind of goes into the soil ends up in the food as well. So farmers of all different sizes are increasingly paying attention to what is in their soil, what kind of microbes and so forth. So in terms of innovation, we're talking about soil testing kits potentially that actually look at the DNA sequencing of what is in the soil, for example. I know beyond the technical part of it, there are a growing number of research trials that look at carbon sequestration. So what kind of, under what kind of environment, like cover cropping or what kind of fertilizers are used to create better soil as well. So much opportunity for research and innovation. And I also think it really then connects to investment, because it costs money to do these trials, and also to pay for these various different kinds of technologies. So I do know that for ag tech startups focused on soil health, great need for that, but also they seek investment into their companies, and they also seek growers who are willing to give them a chance to test out their innovation on their farms as well. And as I know, growers are very, very busy, but there's an opportunity now to actually work with them as well in testing your innovation.
And building on that, it's also thinking about, and on the farm side, it's very important to, that the farmers are, adapting their practices and using technology to improve their practices. But then there's an important role that the market side can also play. And, I just want to highlight the great work that the Center for Good Food Purchasing has been doing on really, I think there was another question here about how are we defining those terms and how are we bringing the transparency about the growing practices? And that's an important point because, until you have a way that you can share that the practices that are happening on farm and really incentivizing and preferencing the purchases from those farms, it's not, I guess it just gives it a really huge point of leverage. I also saw a comment from somebody who was from a large school. They said they were from a large school district, and I think that's really, that's the power of the Center for Good Food Purchasing and the and having the standards is that you are able to really just tap into this enormous purchasing power of the anchor institutions. The schools they're using public money. Public money should be going to support the public good. And so, really, I think that it's tying the practices on farm to the marketplace and really having a way that we can connect those two for mutual benefit. I mean, really bringing the two communities together.
Chris, do you want to go?
Yeah, I have a couple comments on that. I've been fortunate enough to be able to get some foods into local school districts. I've been able to work with some private buyers and food nutrition programs. Something we have to all realize is that, and the subject of cost came up a little bit earlier, but a lot of these local farmers, when you're trying to get fresh products into school districts, they can't necessarily be held to the commercial commodity market pricing. And that's a challenge that we have to get over. And schools have to be able to pay a little bit more for these higher quality products when they're bringing local foods into the system. So that's a hurdle that we have to get over. And I saw the comment as well, as a local school buyer, please acknowledge that these are better quality products. They're raised better. And you want to keep these local products with these local kids. So you're pairing up higher quality products to really feed our kids. So please acknowledge that you can't compare those to a commodity food cost in a mass purchasing system.
Hugely important. Thank you so much. So we've talked about a lot of challenges today. We've talked about some solutions, but we haven't really talked about policy that would help you in your daily lives, your organizations, or any policies that you've seen could, bridge the gaps in your work. So I'm hoping that, some of the panelists here can chime in on what policies would be beneficial for what you've been doing on the ground. Chris, I'm going to go back to you.
Yeah. Well,
Sure.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Tatiana, please go.
Well, building on, what Chris just introduced is that so much of the public school procurement is really dependent on price as the main factor in the procurement decisions. And so until we have a real change in that practice and procurement practices, then the system isn't going to change. And so I think that is really, there's already geographic preference already exists in, USDA school food. And so it's really, how do we, what are the additional tweaks that we need to make so that we are, so that the school districts can preference the food that is grown better, that is better for the local economies, better for the environment.
I think we also have some opportunities as these modified farm bills come up. So, we went through it in 2018. We'll be facing it again in 2022. We need to get out and try to get some of these policies updated for the next farm bill. I know that the farm to school program was pretty successful. I was able to get some products into schools through the farm to school programs, but there was not enough funding. Each school district had an allowance. That allowance didn't go very far to try to get fresh local products into the school. So we need to work on farm bills and different policies that come up and try to get this information to the folks that are writing and implementing these policies so that they know what information needs to go in there. So we need to be communicating with our legislators and lobbyists that are working to get these policies changed and updated. So a lot of our policies are just way behind.
I would say broadband and policy related to getting broadband out there to rural communities, especially. A lot of the farms are in rural communities or where, in order to use the innovation and technology, like there's technology where it captures, for example, certain data or analytics that go to the farmers, you need a good connection and you need to be able to have the bandwidth, frankly, to make that work out. So I would say any policy that's able to get really good, solid broadband out there to community.
I know with the current Black Farmer Act that was introduced with Booker, Warren, and Gillibrand, a part of it is developing a food corps of getting the young people, educated around farming and in technology. And I think that is something that needs to be discussed if we're going to talk about what is the future in terms of innovation, and that relies and falls into the hands of our youth.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really great point to end on. I've been, saying all week that where people are getting vaccinated, we're hopefully on the tail end of this pandemic. But what I fear is that post-pandemic, we will go back to the way things were, that we will forget everything that we have learned that has been uncovered during this pandemic. And policy is such a huge part of that, and investing in our youth. We need to update these different policies and the Farm Bill, as Chris said before. We need to invest more in young people, as Karen said. We really need to invest in what communities are doing and what women leaders are doing, as Amy has pointed out, and those culturally appropriate foods are more needed than ever before, so that communities feel part of the food system, as Tatiana mentioned. So I want to thank you all for your expertise today. This has been a really exciting discussion. And I want to thank all of our experts this week. This is the last in a 5-part series around the Refresh Food Plus Tech Policy platform, which you can find on foodtank.com, which, we've already highlighted a lot of the things today that are part of that platform, including the need for broadband expansion and a digitally skilled workforce and a whole slew of other things. But the experts we've heard from have just been amazing, from all parts of North America, who are working on these issues tirelessly, whether it's around workers or creating more opportunities for women and youth in the food system, or finding different markets for natively grown products. I think it's been so exciting. A special thanks to Chloe Sorvino from Forbes. I could not have done this without her. She's been a trooper in being able to co-moderate these sessions every day. A reminder that today's podcast today's live stream and previous live streams will be available on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And again, thank you to you all. Please stay safe and well. And I hope to see you all in person very soon. Please wear your masks and stay safe.